In the realm of political thought, few figures loom as large as Noam Chomsky. Born in Philadelphia in 1928, Chomsky's influence extends far beyond his academic work as a linguist. He is celebrated as a public intellectual, philosopher, and political activist, consistently challenging established norms. What We Say Goes dives into American foreign policy, dissecting U.S. actions on the global stage. Chomsky argues that the U.S. operates with a sense of exceptionalism, often with devastating consequences. The book's title encapsulates Chomsky's thesis: the U.S. shapes the world in its own image. Chomsky explores the interplay between power and propaganda. He argues that true democratic principles are often undermined by powerful elites and corporate interests. This control of information serves to manufacture consent for policies that might otherwise face opposition. Chomsky delves into the historical context of U.S. foreign policy. He argues that understanding past interventions is crucial to comprehending present-day actions. Chomsky points to numerous historical examples to illustrate this pattern. Chomsky's analysis extends to the realm of economics. He argues that the U.S. leverages its economic might as a tool of foreign policy. Chomsky contends that the pursuit of economic hegemony is a key driver of U.S. actions globally. Chomsky explores the dissonance between the U.S. moral principles and its actions. He argues that the U.S. often employs double standards in its foreign policy. This hypocrisy undermines the legitimacy of U.S. actions and fuels anti-American sentiment. Chomsky dissects the anatomy of American power. He argues that U.S. power extends beyond military might, encompassing economic leverage and cultural hegemony. This multifaceted approach allows the U.S. to shape the global landscape in its favor. Chomsky argues that the U.S. government shapes public opinion to garner support for its foreign policy. This is achieved through sophisticated propaganda campaigns. Chomsky encourages readers to develop a critical lens when consuming news and information. Chomsky identifies tools the U.S. employs to maintain its global dominance. These include support of coups, economic sanctions, and covert operations. These actions allow the U.S. to exert its influence covertly, often undermining the sovereignty of other nations. Section 4. The price of resistance, challenging the hegemon. Chomsky acknowledges the immense challenges faced by countries or movements that resist U.S. hegemony. He argues that the United States has a long history of suppressing dissent, both domestically and internationally, and often employs a range of tactics to undermine or silence those who challenge its power. Chomsky points to the use of economic warfare, such as sanctions or trade embargoes, to punish countries that refuse to toe the U.S. line. He argues that the United States often uses its economic might to isolate and pressure countries that dare to pursue independent foreign policies or challenge U.S. dominance in key regions. Furthermore, Chomsky highlights the United States' history of supporting authoritarian regimes that serve its interests, often turning a blind eye to human rights abuses or democratic backsliding. This support for repressive regimes, Chomsky argues, is part of a broader strategy to maintain stability and control in key regions, even if it means propping up dictators or undermining democratic aspirations. Despite these challenges, Chomsky remains cautiously optimistic about the possibility of challenging U.S. hegemony. He argues that the growing awareness of the true nature of U.S. power, coupled with the rise of alternative power centers and the increasing interconnectedness of the world, creates opportunities for resistance and the emergence of a more just and equitable global order. Ghosts of Indochina, the Vietnam War and its legacy. The Vietnam War stands as a stark example of U.S. interventionism, a topic Chomsky revisits in What We Say Goes. He argues the war was a brutal manifestation of U.S. dominance in Southeast Asia. Chomsky highlights the human cost and enduring legacy of violence and instability. The legacy of the Vietnam War continues to shape U.S. foreign policy today. Turmoil in the Middle East, interventionism and its consequences. Chomsky's analysis extends to the Middle East, a region where U.S. interventionism has had profound and often destabilizing consequences. He argues that the U.S., driven by a complex interplay of strategic, economic, and ideological interests, has repeatedly intervened in the region, often with disastrous results. From the toppling of democratically elected governments to the support of authoritarian regimes, Chomsky paints a stark picture of the human cost of U.S. involvement. Chomsky points to the 1953 coup in Iran, orchestrated by the CIA and British intelligence, which overthrew the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh and installed the Shah, a pro-Western autocrat. This intervention, Chomsky argues, sowed the seeds of resentment and anti-Americanism that ultimately culminated in the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, based on the flawed premise of Saddam Hussein's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction, stands as another stark example of the devastating consequences of U.S. interventionism, according to Chomsky. He argues that the invasion, far from bringing democracy and stability to Iraq, plunged the country into chaos, fueled sectarian violence, and created a power vacuum that allowed groups like ISIS to flourish. Chomsky's critique of U.S. policy in the Middle East extends to its unwavering support for Israel, which he argues has enabled Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories and its continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank. He contends that the U.S., by providing Israel with diplomatic cover and military aid, has become complicit in perpetuating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and obstructing a just and lasting peace. The shadow of the coup, Latin America, and regime change. Latin America has long been a focal point of U.S. interventionism, with a history marked by coups, covert operations, and the support of authoritarian regimes. Chomsky, in What We Say Goes, argues that the U.S. has consistently viewed Latin America through the lens of its own strategic and economic interests, often prioritizing these interests over the well-being and self-determination of the people in the region. Chomsky points to the 1973 coup in Chile, which overthrew the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende and installed the brutal dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. This intervention, Chomsky argues, was a direct response to Allende's attempts to nationalize Chile's copper industry and implement socialist policies that challenged U.S. economic interests. The U.S. also played a significant role in supporting the Contra rebels in Nicaragua during the 1980s, seeking to overthrow the socialist Sandinista government. This support, which included funding, training, and the provision of weapons, fueled a brutal civil war that claimed tens of thousands of lives and devastated the Nicaraguan economy. Chomsky argues that these interventions in Latin America are part of a broader pattern of U.S. attempts to suppress leftist movements, often supporting right-wing dictators or military regimes deemed more amenable to U.S. interests. He contends that this interference in the internal affairs of Latin American countries has had a devastating impact on the region, hindering democratic development and perpetuating cycles of violence and instability. Section 4. The Price of Dissent, Suppressing Resistance to U.S. Power. Throughout What We Say Goes, Chomsky emphasizes that resisting U.S. power comes at a price. He argues that the U.S. has consistently sought to silence or undermine individuals, organizations, and countries that challenge its dominance or its foreign policy objectives. This suppression of dissent, Chomsky argues, is a necessary component of maintaining U.S. hegemony. Chomsky points to the U.S. government's long history of targeting whistleblowers and journalists who expose wrongdoing or challenge official narratives. He cites the case of Edward Snowden, who leaked classified information about U.S. surveillance programs, as a prime example of the government's willingness to go to extraordinary lengths to silence those who expose its secrets. Beyond targeting individuals, Chomsky argues that the U.S. government also employs a range of tactics to undermine or discredit organizations that advocate for social justice, human rights, or alternative foreign policy perspectives. He contends that these organizations are often labeled as radical, anti-American, or even terrorist in an attempt to marginalize them and discourage public support. Chomsky argues that this suppression of dissent, both domestically and internationally, is a testament to the fragility of power. He suggests that the U.S. government's willingness to resort to such measures is indicative of its fear of dissent and its recognition that its legitimacy ultimately rests on the consent of the governed. By silencing dissenting voices, Chomsky argues, the U.S. government seeks to maintain the illusion of consensus and stifle any potential challenges to its authority. Section 1. The Global Chessboard, U.S. Power and the International Order. Chomsky's analysis in What We Say Goes underscores the profound impact of U.S. power dynamics on the very fabric of the international order. He argues that the U.S., operating from a position of unparalleled military and economic dominance, has played a leading role in shaping the rules, institutions, and norms that govern global affairs. However, Chomsky contends that this influence has often been exercised in a manner that prioritizes U.S. interests over the creation of a truly just and equitable international system. Chomsky points to the establishment of the Bretton Woods system after World War II, which created institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, as a prime example of U.S. influence on the international order. While these institutions were ostensibly designed to promote global economic stability and cooperation, Chomsky argues that they have often served as instruments of U.S. economic hegemony, imposing neoliberal policies on developing countries and entrenching global inequalities. Furthermore, Chomsky argues that the U.S. has consistently shown a disregard for international law and institutions when they conflict with its strategic objectives. He points to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was launched without the authorization of the United Nations Security Council, as a stark example of this tendency. This disregard for international norms, Chomsky contends, undermines the legitimacy of the rules-based international order and sets a dangerous precedent for other powerful nations to follow suit. Chomsky suggests that the U.S., rather than acting as a benevolent guarantor of global stability, often behaves as a revisionist power, seeking to reshape the international order to maintain its dominance and advance its interests. This approach, he argues, generates resentment and resistance from other countries, fueling instability and undermining the potential for genuine international cooperation. Section 2. A World of Echoes. The ripple effect of U.S. actions. Chomsky emphasizes that the ramifications of U.S. foreign policy extend far beyond the immediate theaters of intervention, generating ripple effects that reverberate across the globe. He argues that even seemingly isolated interventions can have far-reaching consequences, destabilizing entire regions, exacerbating existing conflicts, and creating new ones. Chomsky points to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 as a prime example of this phenomenon. He argues that the invasion, far from achieving its stated objective of eliminating weapons of mass destruction, destabilized the entire Middle East, fueling sectarian violence, creating a power vacuum that allowed groups like ISIS to flourish, and triggering a massive refugee crisis that continues to this day. Furthermore, Chomsky argues that U.S. support for authoritarian regimes, often in the name of combating communism or terrorism, has had a corrosive impact on democracy and human rights globally. He contends that this support for repressive regimes has emboldened dictators, undermined pro-democracy movements, and created a permissive environment for human rights abuses. Chomsky suggests that the U.S., by prioritizing its own narrow strategic interests over the promotion of human rights and democracy, has undermined its own moral standing and credibility on the world stage. This, he argues, has made it more difficult for the U.S. to promote its values and interests through peaceful and diplomatic means. Section 3. Seeds of Discontent, Anti-Americanism and the Backlash. Chomsky argues that the United States' often heavy-handed approach to foreign policy has fueled a global backlash, manifesting in growing anti-American sentiment and resistance to U.S. dominance. He contends that this resentment is not simply a reaction to specific policies, but rather a product of a deeper unease with the U.S. S perceived role as a global hegemon, often acting with impunity and prioritizing its own interests over those of other nations. Chomsky points to the widespread protests against the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 as a stark example of this global backlash. Millions of people around the world took to the streets to express their opposition to the war, highlighting the growing disconnect between the U.S. government's actions and global public opinion. Furthermore, Chomsky argues that U.S. foreign policy has created a fertile ground for anti-Americanism to take root, particularly in regions that have borne the brunt of U.S. interventionism. He points to the Middle East, where U.S. support for Israel, its military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and its backing of authoritarian regimes have fueled resentment and distrust towards the U.S. Chomsky suggests that this growing anti-American sentiment poses a significant challenge to U.S. foreign policy objectives. He argues that it makes it more difficult for the U.S. to build alliances, exert influence, and promote its interests through peaceful and diplomatic means. Instead, the U.S. often finds itself caught in a vicious cycle, responding to anti-American sentiment with more aggressive policies, which in turn generate further resentment and resistance. Section 4. A Crossroads of Power. Navigating the future of global politics, Chomsky, in What We Say Goes, leaves readers at a crossroads, contemplating the future of global politics in an era marked by shifting power dynamics and growing challenges to the United States-led international order. He argues that the United States can no longer take its global dominance for granted and must adapt to a multipolar world where other power centers are emerging and challenging its hegemony. Chomsky suggests that the United States faces a stark choice. It can either cling to its hegemonic ambitions, resorting to increasingly militaristic and unilateral policies in a futile attempt to maintain its dominance, or it can embrace a more cooperative and multilateral approach, working with other nations to address shared challenges and create a more just and equitable global order. Chomsky argues that the path of cooperation and multilateralism offers the best hope for a more peaceful and prosperous future. He suggests that the United States should prioritize diplomacy, dialogue, and respect for international law in its foreign policy, seeking common ground with other nations on issues ranging from climate change to nuclear proliferation. Chomsky acknowledges that this shift in approach will require a fundamental rethinking of United States foreign policy assumptions and a willingness to relinquish some degree of control over the international order. However, he argues that this is a necessary step if the United States wishes to avoid perpetuating cycles of conflict, instability, and resentment. Ultimately, Chomsky's analysis serves as a call to action, urging readers to engage critically with the complex dynamics of United States power and to advocate for a more just and equitable world order. Section 1. Unveiling the Mechanics of Power. Noam Chomsky's What We Say Goes critiques U.S. foreign policy and power. Chomsky reveals how power operates, often cloaked in democracy and freedom. He challenges readers to question power and consider those affected by U.S. policies. In an era of information overload, Chomsky's analysis is crucial. Social media and 24-hour news make discerning truth from fiction difficult. Chomsky encourages critical thinking to navigate this complex landscape. He dissects U.S. power through military, economic, and cultural means. These tools often advance U.S. interests at others' expense. Chomsky exposes the dangers of unchecked power. Power, left unchecked, tends to corrupt. Chomsky calls for vigilance and accountability. Understanding power dynamics is essential for informed citizenship. Section 2. The imperative of informed citizenship. In an era of global interconnectedness, informed citizenship is crucial. Chomsky reminds us that democracy requires active participation and critical thinking. What We Say Goes urges readers to challenge official narratives and engage actively. Media literacy is essential in the 21st century. Develop skills to critically evaluate sources and seek diverse perspectives. Chomsky encourages questioning power and seeking alternative news sources. Historical awareness is vital for understanding current events. Understanding historical context is essential for comprehending U.S. foreign policy. Chomsky's examination of past interventions provides valuable lessons. What We Say Goes challenges assumptions and exposes uncomfortable truths. This discomfort makes Chomsky's work vital. Confronting power's realities empowers us to become more effective citizens. Section 3. Towards a more just global order. Chomsky envisions a more just world, advocating for cooperation over conflict and shared humanity over narrow national interests. He critiques the current system's inequalities and militarism, urging a shift towards diplomacy and shared solutions. Addressing climate change, nuclear threats, and pandemics requires global cooperation and dialogue. Chomsky calls for informed activism and challenging the status quo to achieve peace and justice. He emphasizes that the future is shaped by our choices today.